This is the Career Journey podcast. I open all of these up with the same question, and it seems to be a good kickoff question. What is the moment in your life where you just like the musical moment? Like it could be a show, it could be a recording, it could be just a family experience. What is the moment that made you think music is my job?
I saw a band in college who you probably couldn't find much information on because they didn't leave that point in college, but they were called Star Drag. They were around in the later '90s, and they kinda had a Pavement, Guided by Voices sound. They were college kids like I was at the time, and I happened to be at their show with 10 other people just kind of randomly, and I saw this band, and I was so blown away, like, after the show, I walked up to them, and I introduced myself, and I said, "I wanna figure out a way to work with you guys," and I didn't have any master plan, and I didn't have any minor plan. I didn't go to the show with any of that stuff in mind. It was just, I was so taken with it, probably because it was the first time that I'd gone to a show knowing nothing about an artist, just happened to be there, and was so blown away by it. I could not believe that I just saw it with, like, nobody else there in a college town for all intent and purpose, even though Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana. And I can remember the adrenaline I felt seeing it. I can remember talking to them after the show. I can remember the next morning waking up so just pumped up about the opportunity to do something, but not knowing exactly what. That it's even thinking about it now, it's just like it's a visceral sensation. And at the time, it was as well. Nothing, I mean, I could say nothing became of it, but everything became of it because I'm still doing this years later. And that was the first point. I mean, beyond all that, like I've been listening to music probably like you since I was old enough to listen to music, actively listen to music. And I've been a fan, super fan since I was a kid, and I've never stopped listening since. And here we are.
So you effectively became their manager? Would that be the
You could call it
easiest
that.
word?
You call it, yeah, that's what it was for something where you've got no experience, they've got no experience, and for all intent and purpose, nothing went anywhere either. But that was the idea, and at the time, especially them being in college, I mean, I was actively doing things. I was booking some shows for them and trying to get their record out there. But the other reality was this is college, and two of the four guys left the band shortly thereafter because that's the way things go when people are coming to their close of college sometimes. And so it's just kind of the way that it went, but it sparked my imagination enough in working in music to kind of follow that to whatever points, it's taken me. That's not I wasn't political science major in college, a long college career. I'm sure to my parents' chagrin, but I did get out of it with a piece of paper that said I had attended and graduated, and I did well in my political science classes. But that was I was looking at a different route at the time. Was interning for my now still wife's now deceased uncle who was a oil and gas lobbyist in Louisiana. And that's kind of what I was thinking. That's the path that I thought I was going to go down, which is not the no disrespect to oil and gas lobbyists, but that's just not what I was cut out to be in any way, shape, or form. But I knew that he was doing it. I loved learning about legislature and all that other kind of stuff, and so I was doing that while I was in school for part of my college career anyway. And as I started to get towards the end of college, I knew that law school would have to be next from what he told me because lobbyists write the legalese into these things that become bills and all that stuff. And, I considered doing it. I thought about doing it. I thought myself into believing I was going to do it. But the reality was my grades were not strong. My interest was not even there in the academic. And music kind of started to what I just described to you kind of happened in the midst of all this, and I thought maybe I should pursue something that I'm passionate about rather than something that I think I can probably make a lot of money doing. That I knew even at the time, knowing what I knew of it, like I wasn't cut out to be that person. So here we are,
Mhm. Yeah. So what year was this, if you don't mind me asking?
late night.
That late 90s. So early internet, effectively.
I mean, you can call it that, but unless you lived it, it would have bear no resemblance to the internet that my children, are aware of. But yeah, it existed, but it was you had to trudge through it to get contact information, to do anything practical, work related. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this era, but like it was useful for what it could be at the time, but it was so slow. I mean, we're talking about dial up.
Yeah. So you didn't have like the resources that a band has now to get out into the world anyways, and you were in college. What was your like what was I this is a very broad question, but what was your process back then for getting the band into the eyes of bookers and college radio and whatnot. Like,
Well,
how did you find that info?
this band was over before it began in the terms that you're asking me to describe now, but shortly thereafter, there were other bands, one of which was kind of like just coming out of college. I'd kind of similar experience after this, where I'd gone to one of their shows and I was so blown away at 2 in the morning too, like talking to this band after the show. It's like, I'll help I'll wear all the hats until there is a publicist, till there's a booking agent, till there's X, Y, and Z, and I'll manage. But in the interim, I'll do all of that stuff. Tour manage. I had a van at the time too, which was really the carrot for this band that had no money and no transportation. But they had Rounder Records interested in signing them, and that was like the more full into this transition of what I described initially with that other band that was around the same time frame. I forget what she even just asked me because I had an answer to it. What was it?
How did you find the people you needed to find effectively without the internet being
So,
reliable?
yes, right. So, with this band in particular, they ended up getting a publicist and the label deal happened and we got a booking agent and all that stuff. But in the interim, I would have to book their shows. And there were some other bands that area I had to do it too. And I remember there was a couple of resources. One was the Musicians Atlas, was like a magazine that had a listing of all the US clubs, their capacities, the hours, the office hours for the the talent buyers. Because this was an era where you had to call them. Sometimes you're calling some small club in St. Louis and you have to call the person who doubles as the GM between 11 PM and 2 AM to try to talk them into booking this band that they've never heard of. And I was piecemealing all of these things together, and it gave me a rudimentary understanding of how booking works, how touring works, all of those different things on a very basic financial level, certainly. But you had the kind of the outreach was on the internet. It was the same way. As I recall, you would go to a website and you would find out this granular information. And I remember there would be times of the day you had to call these people because it was before cell phones were in everybody's pocket. It was certainly before email was as robust on any of those devices. So you just kind of it felt more like a 24-hour a day job, and I guess it still is that way if you wanna work that way. I think that's for any occupation, but back then, you certainly when you were figuring it out, I was also doing this in New Orleans, which there's a music there is some industry there, but given the time frame and everything that goes along with it, I wasn't interning at a big agency. I wasn't learning from people who had been doing this for 30 years. I was kind of teaching myself to do it in an era where if you wanted to read about how to do this stuff, it was the Passman book. There might have been 1 or 2 other things that had starting to pop up, but you really had to dig just to find out, like, clues on how to do a lot of these things, unless you lived or had moved to a major market and gone to CAA or whatever and learned from the mailroom up, like, how does this business work, as an example. That's the whatever the opposite of that is, that's where I came from, just by geographic proximity of where I was.
So you effectively were a punk,
And in probably a few ways, but I don't know if in the way that you're describing. Now, punks would have thought I was a poser even though I was listening to punk rock, you know?
but you the heart of punk marketing effectively is like you did it because you had to do it, and
Yes.
you did what you could because though you used the resources that you had available,
Yes.
which
That's
is so yeah. And then I'm assuming you weren't like spreading peanut butter all over you.
no, that had not happened yet.
Okay. That happens when you have kids, really.
That does happen when you have kids. It's funny that you mentioned that. It's this great book I found on the Stooges recently that I'd never seen before. It's got to be 300 pages, and it's mostly pictures, but it also reads in a narrative form, semi. And it's so granular with details that I didn't necessarily always know about the Stooges, even though I feel like I've read everything or watched everything you can know about it. And then you find something in a record store and you go, wow, there's more out there.
What's the book?
I'd have to go over there and grab it. I'll get it before you and I hang up. I'll go and I'll grab it, but
Okay.
it's across the room.
All right. I'm intrigued because the Stooges are not exactly a band without documentation or scholarly research done on them. Like them and Velvet Underground and The Clash are probably the three most documented. Well, I guess in the Beatles, but nonetheless. So Baton Rouge was where you started. I can think of two bands to break out of Baton Rouge, and I'm thinking Better Than Ezra and Givers, and it feels like you were working kind of in between those two.
But I was, I was very into Better Than Ezra when they were kind of coming on their way up. It's you probably hadn't heard this, but they put out this cassette that was their record, but they only had enough money to put it on cassette called Surprise. That was like you wouldn't recognize it compared to their later works at all, but, like, it was a cool record that I still think start to finish is, like, a great record. Probably sounds more like earlier Lemonheads or Soul Asylum before they were
Mm.
major label bands. Like, it kind of that's what it sounded like. And Givers I'm familiar with and booked later down the line, not from an agent standpoint, but as a buyer in New Orleans when they were kind of coming up. But yeah, the era we're talking about kind of is in between both of those in terms of coming out of school and starting to work in it.
Right. So after you did the whole like trying to help bands up, what was your next thing? Like when did you start like finding regular labor, I guess?
Like I said, I lived in New Orleans as a kid, then I moved away to Baton Rouge, North Louisiana for a couple years, came back when I graduated high school to LSU, and after LSU, I got married at the end of college and moved to New Orleans after graduation, which is where my family's both sides are from, and had like 5 jobs, none of them full time because I wanted to work in music. So I was putting up posters for Tipitinas, I was putting up posters for House of Blues, I was putting on the wristbands at shows at Tipitinas, I was taking the money at the door at Tipitinas, I was interning upstairs at Tipitinas, I was working at a local record label. There's probably other things too, and I was starting to at the same time, what I considered to be the gig was I was starting to work with bands like the Rounder band I described, and more of them trying to take them from where they're just it's not a slight I'm not meaning it as a slight, they're just a local band, but I'm saying they're at the local level solely in terms of profile, to finding a in hopes of staying the manager, finding them the agent, finding them the publicist, a label, hopefully all that stuff to varying degrees of success. But in those interim period, I would wear all of those hats. So I was learning in a self-taught way and probably in a lot of ways not the best way to do things because this isn't the rock this we're not in the this isn't the rocket science business that we're in, but it's also not intuitive either on the industry side. Like if you haven't been told what a talent buyer is, like when I was a kid I thought, what's this pretentious title this guy gave himself? It's like, no, that's what that person's called. It's not the booker. You can call yourself the booker, but talent buyers you learn is an actual word for what a position is in the industry. Little things like that you kind of learn along the way. But because I was doing these things, I learned kind of more what I wanted to do and more of what I didn't want to do. I was trying to manage these bands early on when I was a young person taught me that I, number one, didn't want to be a manager, but it also kind of gave me a broad general view of what do the different positions in the industry do by actually doing it to the best that I was able to. And I was also doing the venue stuff to make enough money to make enough money to not make much money, but in New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina, and even probably to certain extents now, but certainly then, like, you didn't need $1,000,000 to get by then, you know? So, I was able to make enough to keep making enough to keep staying in music, which was the goal. Sometimes I look back on it and go, "Would I have that kinda drive right now if I needed to never sleep, literally, and to do all these things that maybe I didn't wanna do because I thought maybe I was deserving of more because I had a college education?" And it's like, no. And all of those things that at the time I thought were a grind, like waking up at 6 in the morning to go put posters up on telephone poles before they got torn off by folks that didn't want them on Magazine Street or whatever. You learn how to promote on a grassroots level. And at the end of the day, that's what works. I mean, it's progressed into social media and the way that we market those ways. But I say this periodically, like whether it's 1999 or 2026, if you go to your local coffee shop and there's an 11 by 17 poster up of a band that you look at, you can't unsee that you saw it. It worked at one point in time and it can still work now. That's not to suggest social media doesn't work because money gets spent there too. But I've seen I haven't seen the evolution of the 20th century, but I've seen kind of both sides of marketing in music, pre and post the internet era, really. And when I say the internet era, I mean when you could actually use it, it wasn't dial up. And really, that means even more to the point, social media, because the email mailing list was just an extension of the one that maybe you or I would get in the mail and it'd be a postcard of a band. Oh, wow, they're going to be on tour. I'm going to go see them when they come through here. Now you're plugged into the universal mind online if you want to be with everything that's out there in terms of bands you like, artists you like, or whomever.
Yeah, thinking about how I live in the Bay Area and I still see flyers in coffee shops and it's kind of nice, but it's also like you're less likely to ignore that than say an Instagram story ad that's just noise until you can get to the next thing.
I guess it's just a person to person thing. I think it's easier to block certain things out when they're everyday things that you bump into. I don't know. It's crazy how much things have changed just because of solely because of technology, really. But I do remind myself, like, once upon a time, because I was not there for all of it, but certainly part of it, like, bands sold tickets to shows, promoters sold tickets to shows without having social media. By contrast, they might have had MTV, they might have had radio support, but there were bands that were on neither of those things that were out there playing prior to all that. You could point towards, I guess, any number of things. Some of them were dialed into the underground, which that's more what I have an understanding of because it was music I was into that was on neither of those things that I was made aware of through somebody's older brother or sister, really, when I was a kid. There weren't any zines necessarily floating around that I had access to before the internet. My daughter, who just turned 14, she's known, I can see the difference in how much knowledge you can have about music just because of Spotify being around. You can bump into everything. You can know at least the names of bands. Like when I was a kid, if I wanted to listen to Black Flag, I had to buy one of their records and hope that there was enough on there that I wanted to listen to. And I like Black Flag. I'm just saying that might not have been everybody's experience buying a Black Flag record. And you would even have needed a shop that carried that at a certain point because when they were active, I don't even know if there were record stores I could just walk into and necessarily buy one of their records. That would have been a little smaller than probably being an active Black Flag fan, but you probably get what I'm saying. The
But yeah,
times
I get it.
the times have changed and accessibility. It's like I feel now I have less of a record collection when I have everything at my fingertips. Not everything, but much of what I could ever have searched for in a record store. I feel like I have less of a record collection now than I did when I only had a finite amount that was physical sitting somewhere and I had to like get to know it because that's what I owned as opposed to now where we can access everything, but what do we really remember we have?
Yeah, and it's pre-saving a record doesn't even necessarily mean you'll listen to it.
How many times have you made a playlist and there was a song you put on it and you come across it 3 months later and you add it and you go, oh shit, I added this 3 months ago and I forgot about it already.
Yeah, or you hear something like I actually find myself like I have the single of the week column on the site, and I'll hear a song out in the world and be like, "Oh, this is great. I wonder who this is," and realize that like I wrote about it 6 months ago. So I definitely get how that is. All right. So bringing back to the story. So what prompted you to leave Louisiana?
Hurricane Katrina.
I'm assuming there's more to that story.
Well, I mean, and from basically the time that we were just chatting on until then, I got a business partner. We were booking clubs as like talent buyers in New Orleans, and there was one in Colorado that he was doing prior to us partnering on. We were doing PR for bands because I'd learned how to do that at a time where tour press was far more impactful. Getting a pick in the weekly would actually get you some traction on ticket sales. We were doing graphic design for artists, kind of messing around with management a little bit with some local bands still at the time. But we were doing that and we were having we were having success in New Orleans and we were able to kind of, that was our job. We had people that worked for us and it was fun and it was all that stuff. And Hurricane Katrina happened and it created enough of a ripple for us personally that we had lost some clients because of a venue getting destroyed during Katrina called Twiropa, which is not around anymore, but it was a rad warehouse at the time that was on the up. And a couple other things went away. And my partner at the time and my business partner, talked about opening up an office in another market at some point. But he had just had a child. My wife and I just bought a house. The reality is, if this wouldn't have been sprung upon us, I don't know if we would have actually been actively said, all right, yeah, let's move somewhere now. But this kind of forced our hand because it put a bunch of stuff into disarray. And so we thought, well, let's go to New York or Los Angeles. And the weather in Los Angeles, amongst other things, was a little bit more welcoming. And my wife is from Southern California, so that helped as well. So we came out here and I've been here for the most part since then. There was a couple of years where I was splitting the time between the two places, but I've been here since then. That's what prompted the move to California. And that was, 20 years ago, 21.
So how long did it take you to get your footing once you're here? Because like in like New Orleans is a big music town, but everything dwarfs LA.
But everything what?
Dwarfs LA
Yeah.
in in ter-
Well, fortunately, we had friends out here that were willing to help us and chat with us if we didn't know them. Because I mean, like we moved out here. I think my wife was in going back and forth to San Diego for much of it, where her family is, and my business partner at the time's wife and child were coming out here periodically, but going back home to take care of stuff. We both still had stuff houses there that needed to be tended to, and you couldn't even go back for the first probably couple of months. They were allowing people back by area code or zip code rather, as I recall. So we just started hustling. I mean, by that I just mean like went into overdrive, like, okay, we can't afford to be out here if we don't make things happen. And we were able to get a club or 2 to book to kind of keep the wheels rolling, and, we trimmed down we were the only ones that came out, and one person that worked with us moved out here with us too, but we lost a lot of other folks that were in the mix just because they didn't move to it was not everybody was gonna be able to just say, "Hey, let's just go out and move to another city now." Everybody was dealing with their own situations. Some people lost homes, some people lost livelihoods, everything that went along with it. I felt lucky in the big scheme of things. I wish that it had not have happened, the hurricane happened, but, we were able to get out of it okay, and that we were able to make the transition to Los Angeles and stay there. And what ended up happening was, amicably, my business partner and I, after a year and a half or so, we split just because he was more into the venue side of things and I was more into the other side of things. The common denominator being, and this really has been the central thread all the way through me getting out of school, is what he and I started doing in New Orleans when we first partnered was we started booking a small club called the Hi Ho Lounge, which is still around, different ownership, but it's a small club on St. Claude. And I didn't really wanna do it, but it was a way to make a little bit more money and to throw some more money into the pot of what we were doing, and he loved that was what he was into. He wasn't as interested in the PR stuff or any of that as I was. So we did it, and it became this thing that, then we got another club in New Orleans, then another one. Usually it would be, we'd leave the smaller one, get a little larger one, etcetera. But all through the years, that's what I was doing in order to do these other things in music that I was very, very much interested in. Not that I lacked interest in booking music venues. I mean, there's a competitive component that if you grew up competitive or playing sports or both, like it kind of feeds that desire in you. Not that you can't compete in other aspects of music, but it's you're going for shows and you're probably not the only one. That's just the nature of it. But in the early years, it was more of the let me keep booking venues in order to keep doing all this other stuff. And then over the course of time, it just became more and more of the focus to where that is what I do now. It's been what I'm doing all the way through the years, but less and less of the peripheral stuff has just kinda slipped away because of that, because it's taken more time, more effort, and just where my interest has been. In a perfect world, you can do everything you want whenever you want, but in the real world, you're able to do what you're able to do given the 24 hours in a day.
Okay. So after swimming around LA for a bit with different projects, you ended up with an Terragram Ballroom, if, from what I've seen. And so you booked the opening of a very high profile new space. And like I'm in the Bay Area and vividly remember Terragram opening. How did that fall into your lap? What was like your mindset and like,
Well,
yeah,
there
the
so when I moved to California, one venue had gotten destroyed, and I think the Hi Ho we weren't booking anymore at that point. But the venue that used to be the old Howlin' Wolf that we booked before Twiropa was bought by somebody else, and they made it Republic New Orleans. And I was booking that the first few years that was open, and then One Eye Jacks for a bunch of other years as well. So I was still booking clubs in New Orleans, living in Los Angeles. And the couple of clubs that I'd booked in Los Angeles upon getting there the first year or so, my business partner kind of ran with that. And around that time frame, I had partnered with Justin Gage on Aquarium Drunkard, which was a popular music blog. It still exists behind a paywall. It's 20th anniversary. Actually, we're doing the 20th anniversary show at Terragram the end of the month with SML playing, but that's a separate conversation. But kind of in between New Orleans and then Terragram, and then several years into Terragram, I was doing Aquarium Drunkard with Justin, and we had a label, Autumn Tone, that we had launched that was kind of a companion to it. And we were doing that, and I was still booking the New Orleans clubs. So there was all these things that I was doing, especially in that iteration of the blogosphere that were kind of a particular profile where I'm still a fan of the website. And even though Justin and I are no longer business partners, but we're still best pals. And because of Aquarium Drunkard's visibility, we had access to cool bands before anybody knew about them that might want coverage on the blog. And when these dots would get connected, if we thought it was cool, we'd say, "Hey, this is great. Can we put out your record?" In the first several years, there were license deals, and then it kind of rolled into a joint venture with Brett Garowitz at Epitaph and Anti, where we actually had money to sign these bands. That was in that middle area between getting to LA and then 2015 of Telegram opening. And even after Telegram opened, I was still business partners with Justin. We were still putting out records. I was still booking One Eye Jacks the first few years that Telegram was open. But because I was kind of plugged into all these different things that were either timely or of a similar music aesthetic maybe to what Michael Swear, who owns Terragram, but owns Bowery Ballroom, Mercury Lounge, and what he'd been doing and built up there. You know, we had there was a lot of overlap, at least in the things that we were interested in from a music perspective. So Rio Hackford, who owned he's deceased. He died a couple years ago, but he owned One Eye Jacks, which I was booking. He owns a bar on the same block as Terragram before Terragram was even open called Monty. It's still there. Shares an owner with Terragram, Joe Baxley. He had told me that there was going to be this venue opening 2 doors down from Monty 2 or 3 years before it even opened because these things move on the slow side. And, you know, I was like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know how you can just plug in a venue in Los Angeles, you know, on that size, just knowing what the landscape's like. But then he told me who Joe was gonna be opening it with, and he said, "It's Michael Swear from Bowery Presents," and I thought, "Okay, that's the kind of person that could, like, make something work." And a couple of years went by, I wasn't even thinking about it. And then one day, randomly, I asked Rio, I said, "Did they" this is when I knew it was being constructed and supposedly gonna be opening soon, even though it wasn't built yet, or finished. And I asked Rio, I said, "Did they find a talent buyer for the venue yet?" And he's like, "No." He's like, "Do you wanna talk with them?" And I was downtown in Los Angeles, and he said, let me." I said, "Yeah, if you can make an intro," thinking like he'll put me on an email or something, it'll happen later. And I got put on a thread with Michael Swear, like, within the hour, and Michael happened to be in LA, so we went and had coffee, hit it off right from the beginning, and then the next day, he took me to Terragram when it was still all, you know, dust and stages being built and there's workers everywhere, and you kind of see what it's gonna be, but it's not there yet. And we kinda hung out all weekend and came to some shows that we were involved with, my business partner and I, and a few different other cool things in LA that just happened to be happening, and we hit it off. And we stayed in touch for the next couple of months, and, he wanted to hire me, but he was used to hiring people where they say, "Okay, this is your job and you're not doing any of this other stuff that you're currently working on." And I said, "Look, I want this job. I think with you building this venue, it's gonna be a success." I said, "But Justin's my business partner and Rio who connected us, I still book his club, and, like, this is all kind of part of why I would even be the person for this gig, so I wanna continue it." And he held out, held out, held out, and then he finally said after a couple months, he's like, "All right, I want you to do it, but this has got to be, you know, you got to make this a focus." And I told him that I would, and I did. And so all of it kind of coexisted for several years. And then just over time, Moroccan Lounge was opened, and then a couple years back, Bellwether. But prior to Bellwether, sometime around Moroccan Lounge opening, it was just I was more and more occupied with things happening in Los Angeles and less able to be attentive to New Orleans for One Eye Jacks. And at certain points, I just said, "This needs to become more of the focus," and it just kept becoming more of the focus until kind of where we're sitting now, you know? Justin and I still in theory, we still have the label, but we don't actively put out records, so I'm fortunate that we have this catalog stuff that still makes some licensing money, and it's cool stuff, and down the line, if we wanna reactivate things, he'd be more than interested in doing it, as would I. It's just with our current schedules of things, it's like, how much time do we have to put into something that makes money, but not it's not what's gonna only make us the money, you know?
Yeah, it's something that most people I know that own record labels have to have another job, which is just the nature of it anyways. But yeah, I mean, it also makes sense to have something steady.
For sure, for sure.
And I know we're coming up on the edge of time, and I haven't even touched on ATG yet. So after moving on from there, you your current project is fascinating because you're booking music for a company that does touring Broadway stuff. How did that happen?
A friend of mine is who's now my boss, books he's the director of programming at the Sanger in New Orleans. Known him for a bunch of years. Sanger's a beautiful room if you're unfamiliar with it. It's a theater in New Orleans. He had been having success there, booking things direct and bringing more live events and comedy to the Sanger in addition to the touring Broadway, which was not so much what ATG was focused on. They're one of the big 3 Broadway companies. I don't have the Broadway background, so my knowledge of all of it is very rudimentary. But most of these venues, ATG owns. They own the buildings. You know, they're based out of London. They own stuff in West End. They own Broadway, 6 Broadway buildings on Broadway in New York. those are only Broadway. Broadway lives there for long, extended periods of time. There's not a LCD sound system slipping into the lyric, on Broadway. Kings in Brooklyn doesn't do the Broadway stuff. It almost exclusively does music and comedy event stuff. But Eric had been having some success in New Orleans at the Sanger, and Kevin in Texas had similar situation in San Antonio with their theater, where he was bringing a lot of stuff that was not just the touring Broadway. And they had so much success with it that the company decided, all right, let's focus on building out the MCE side of things with ATG, because we have these beautiful rooms. Touring Broadway, predicated on the market outside of New York, it'll be there 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever the runs are for. But you have this other space to fill if you can fill it. And so me and a couple of other people have consequently been brought on board. Me just recently, I've only been there for the last 2 or 3 months. But the idea is for the San Francisco venues, let's say, it's people know those venues are there, but bringing more visibility, reaching out to agents. I've been booking shows for ages with a lot of these agents, saying there's a time and place, like with the rooms in San Francisco, given this cost of going into those rooms, the scale, all that stuff, it's a certain niche of artists that can even play those rooms. But if it's an artist that wants the seated show, they want that experience for their audience, et cetera, et cetera. We just want to make sure that they're aware that these buildings are there. And whether it's booking it direct or working with Another Planet or Golden Voice or Live Nation, specifically in San Francisco, or Folk Yeah, or any promoter. We have the buildings. We want the shows. If it's booking it direct, great. If we're working as a co-promoter or rental even with somebody else, great. We just want the shows in the rooms. So that's the job at hand, is bringing that into these rooms in San Francisco and California, and then assisting in any of these other markets where we have buildings too, where we think based on the relationship or what I might be working on in comparison to someone in one of the other markets, if we can help leverage or just bring awareness and bring these shows in across the portfolio, we want to do that. So that's what the gig is. It's these historic theaters by and large. There's a couple of newer buildings, but the company's growing and they've got these great rooms, and we're trying to bring as much into it as possible beyond just the Broadway stuff. And the Broadway stuff is great, but you're not going to have, outside of the theaters on Broadway proper, you're not going to have touring Broadway 365 in a theater. It just there's not enough of it to fill that much space. So here
Yeah,
we are.
it yeah, this is, I think, before your time doing this, but at the Golden Gate Theater in San Francisco, saw that's where I saw the David Bernstein Vincent tour, and I thought, "This is amazing because it's such a tightly choreographed theatrical show, and seeing it in a space design where every vantage point gets that same impact was I thought it was brilliant. And yeah, is there to kind of wind things up, is there anything you'd like to see in that environment that you haven't gotten to make happen yet?
Well, it's early there. So, a lot of the stuff that I've been a part of working on isn't announced yet, might not be confirmed yet. We just announced Robert Plant this week with Another Planet. That's an exciting one. But honestly, I can't think of much that I wouldn't want to see in these theaters. They're beautiful theaters. That said, look, not every show is meant for a fully seated experience. A new young punk band is not going to translate as well in one of these rooms, just from an audience standpoint, as David Byrne. Leave it to David Byrne to come up with something creative that's going to work well in any space, but particularly a theater. But I think it's just more of bands that can fit that they can sell that many seats in that type of building. I can't think of one that I wouldn't want to see in that setting. Again, not every artist is made for every single setting, but for here, I can't imagine much that doesn't, at least of a certain size, just because of the nature of these rooms. I was in New Orleans at the Sanger during Jazz Fest. I saw the Meters reunion there. I saw Wilco in there. They also had, Trombone Shorty in there during Jazz Fest. A couple nights of Goose, which is on the jam side. A couple nights of Cake, which is an older band from the MTV era that's still super popular. Did 2 nights there, and kind of everything in between. And it's like it's such a beautiful room if it looks good and it sounds good, and I could say that going back to clubs that I've been involved with, Terragram's a great example, just brick for brick, like It looks good. It sounds good. The flow is great. It functions for the audience and it functions for the artists, you know, regardless of the venue. I think that applies across the board. If it looks good for the audience, if it sounds good for the audience, if the artist likes performing there, that's the checklist to me. You know, you got to make math work, but that's in any endeavor.
Yeah, although I guess with Robert Plant, that's not one that you would have as many worries about, but I I did see that listed, and I thought that is the last time I saw him was at Hardly Strictly Bluegrass, which was not the right space, but Hardly Strictly Bluegrass is a difficult space for anybody to handle if you've ever been out to it.
I have. I have.
Yeah, yeah. The yeah, but no nonetheless, yeah, you're doing really interesting work, and just to since we are Bay Area focused, I'll do the quick rundown of what you have listed. Airplane,
Yes.
the greatest film of all time, of course.
You said it.
Yep. And, Art Garfunkel, the greatest Garfunkel of all time.
Correct. Correct on both. Look, there's a lot of that's one thing that there's a couple things with my job now compared to over the years that are new to me and also exciting. Something like the airplane, the screening, and the Q&A, that's not happening on club level venues. I mean, it can, but it's made for this kind of a theater, and it's unique. And I think it's personally, I think it's pretty cool. I didn't book it; it was here. It was on sale when I got here, but I love that that's something that can exist here. And the other thing is getting to work with promoters. You know, I come from the independent world of clubs. So there might be a local promoter that you tag up one on a show to help market from time to time, but you're not working with Live Nation or AEG, not for personal reasons, just that's the nature of independent clubs. You have to have the calls coming into you to control your calendar. Now I get to do that aspect of it, but I can work with these promoters to help get shows in the room, which opens that door as well. So it opens up the variety of things that I can be involved with on the venue side in ways that just didn't present themselves before. And again, there are buildings, so you want the shows, you know? And I guess you could say there's something similar about that with a club, but at the club level, it didn't exist in that way. You have to book the shows yourselves, or you lose that control of the calendar. But with theaters, you need that aspect of it, which is exciting.
Yeah, it's cool, and it feels like it's the right creative stretch, like, after to get into after so many years of independent rock venues. Yeah, it's I'm excited to see what comes up next, and sadly, I have to wrap this up, and I feel like
Okay.
I sped through a lot. You've been awesome. Thank you for being an excellent guest.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, yeah, I saw this the your publicist tossed this out there, and I thought, "Hmm,